Hello, I'm Kate Kelly, and welcome to American Snapshots. This is a video series of little-known stories of America's past. Now, I know you have all heard of the Boston Massacre, but how many of you have heard of the Boston Molasses? Probably not many. The incident was exactly what it sounds like, which was that it was a tremendous flood of molasses, and it was the amount was so great that people actually were caught up in it and died. So this was actually quite a natural disaster, so to speak. Now, the incident dates back to 1919, and what happened was that the storage tank had been built for holding molasses, and it was built down near the harbor because while molasses was certainly the main sweetener used by Americans at that time, it was also something that could be fermented into ethyl alcohol, and this was something they could use for war materials. So it had been built in 1916 and obviously was still being used at that time in 1919. And in 1916, though, America was not really ready to go to war, and so when they had to kind of gear up for everything they knew was coming in World War I, everything was done as quickly as possible. Now, people at the time could not have possibly known that the kind of steel that they were using was ill-fated. It was the wrong type of steel, but that was technology that did not exist at that time. What they did know was the rivets were being used and were being put in with a lick and a promise. So that was an obvious shortcut that they had known that they had taken. Now, the people of Boston soon realized that these rivets actually leaked molasses, and molasses was a sweetener. You could also take it home and ferment it into drinking alcohol, and Prohibition was coming. So people would come with their containers and catch whatever molasses they could and go home with it. So I think people complained, but they didn't complain that much about it. So then we reached mid-January 1919. Now, we all know January in Boston is a bitter cold time, but on January 15th, there was an unseasonable jump in the temperature. The temperature jumped up into the mid-40s, and so all of a sudden you've gone from -2 degrees up to mid-40s. You have a molasses tank that is almost completely full, and the combination in some way caused the thing to explode. The explosion happened in about noon. Now, any place at noontime is usually a busy area. You have workers around the area, you have people, running around, you have cars and wagons, and at that time it was a transition in transportation time, so you also have some horses and wagons, and you have, street dogs that are wandering around. In the process, this molasses explodes, and it sends out an 8-foot wave of molasses, and it's going at 35 miles an hour. So you can imagine that sort of thing barreling down the street. Obviously, it captured everything in its pathway and kept on going. It was so powerful that it could knock down buildings, and it got to the L train and it pushed over those supports. So it was really something that was amazing. Now, the Boston Post had done a very nice job of describing it, and they wrote, "Molasses, waist deep, covered the street and swirled and bubbled above the wreckage. Here and there struggled a form, whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass showed where any life was. Horses died like so many flies on sticky fly paper. The more they struggled, the deeper in the mess they were ensnared. Human beings, men and women, suffered likewise." So it was really quite a terrible incident to have happen. Now, why, you might ask? How did this thing possibly happen? Needless to say, there was a lawsuit that resulted right after the incident, and in investigating it, they could not again tell what the quality of the steel was, but they did spot that two things had happened. One was that the storage tank had been built in a rush and therefore had never been adequately pressure tested, and it had rarely been fully full, and in this case it was almost full. They also picked up the problem with the rivets. So it was one of those things that it indeed was in some ways an accident waiting to happen. In the 21st century, actually, scientists have gotten interested in it and were wondering what had actually happened. And when they went back and investigated, they determined that the thing was ill-fated from the beginning. The type of steel that was being used was so brittle that it was one thing that it was going to be guaranteed that it was going to not be able to breathe with the molasses, and indeed, it exploded. But in the meantime, we go back to January 15th, 1919, and we have to worry about cleanup and rescue. There happened to be a training vessel docked at the harbor, and there were 116 cadets on it. And so those young men all rushed off their ship and came in to see what they could do about rescuing anybody that they could. But of course that involved getting into the molasses, and it was, quite a mess and very difficult to perform the rescue operation. They spent 4 days checking the area to make sure that they had located anything that could possibly survive in that molasses and muck. But by the time they were complete, by this time you've had lots of people coming from other parts of Boston to see what was going on at the harbor. In the process, the people have walked through puddles of molasses, and as they've left the area, they've left molasses tracks on their way, taking parts of the molasses with them. So the cleanup literally took weeks. The harbor itself was 8 months before it got rid of its brownish color. It was really quite a nightmare over the time. Now, today, that particular part of Boston has 2 city parks and a whole recreation complex in the area. So it's very much transformed from what it was. There is still a plaque that describes the massacre. And when tour guides actually come down and bring people to the area, they describe that on a really hot day, you can still smell the odor of molasses. Thank you very much for joining us for American Snapshots.